everyone. My name is Garvin, and I read things and talk about them on the internet. Today, we're looking at a fairly heavy and serious subject, the Nazis. We're not going to be tackling the many crimes and atrocities of the Nazi regime, but I do want to make it clear that I view the Nazi regime as, if not the evilest state in human history, easily in the top 10. And the only reason we're talking about them is because I don't want to ignore a part of the Atlantis arc in history, even if it's a really troubling and upsetting one. That said, if this video feels too heavy for you already, please feel free to skip and join us again next week when we're going to be talking about fiction again. I want you to take care of yourself and be good to yourself, all right? For those of you who are going to stick with me, we're going to be looking at pre-existing ideas, beliefs, and movements because the Nazis didn't actually invent a lot. What they did is they cooked these pre-existing ideas, twisted them, and rode them into power. Once there, they plunged Europe and North Africa into the largest war waged in human history. And if it's not one of the most lethal and brutal wars, it's in the competition for that title. Now, when it comes to the crossover between Nazis and the occult, that's an entire subject in itself, and I hope you'll excuse me for just focusing on Atlantis and a little bit of Hyperborea here, because otherwise, this would be a whole series in of itself, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, I'm not the dude to make that series. I did not enjoy this. This is not something I want to come back to every week. But if you would like more information, check out the book Hitler's Monsters, A Supernatural History of the Third Reich by Eric Kurlander. I found it extremely useful. I'll leave a link to the book's Amazon page below. There's another book I looked at that I ended up not using too much out of. It was written by an actual member of the Nazi Party who was probably murdered by his fellow Nazis. There's not a lot of evidence for or against, but his death's suspicious, and he was part of that element of the Nazi Party that was purged once it took power. That book would be Lucifer's Court, A Heretic's Journey in Search of the Lightbringers by Otto Rahn. Like I said, I didn't use that book, but it's an interesting window, so I'll link that as well below. To get a good grip on this, we actually have to go back before the Nazis, because the Nazis, and to be fair, other movements like them, they don't just spring up fully formed from the void. The Nazis were an expression of dark, ugly things that were present already in Nazi society. These movements always are. They are always tapping into pre-existing things, and everyone should remember that. So we're going to head back to German unification. Now, I don't mean the one in the 20th century, but the one from 1866 to 1871, the one with Bismarck, if that helps. Before this unification, there wasn't a modern German state in the way we would think of it in the 21st century. Germany, in a lot of ways, was a region, a place, instead of a full-blown country. Now, that's an oversimplification, and I'm generalizing a lot here, but I hope you guys will give me that leeway and just bear with me. Now, the Germans did see themselves as a single people. That was the drive towards unification, but they still had to hammer out a common national identity. And despite the idea that everyone saw themselves as fellow Germans, there was still a lot of obstacles there. Germans in Bavaria, for example, spoke a pretty different dialect from what was spoken in Prussia, and Germans from Anhalt wouldn't necessarily have that many common traditions as Germans from, say, Baden. They had enough to come together and see each other as a single people, but keep in mind the differences between, say, someone in Portland, Oregon, and Mobile, Alabama, and you'll get an idea of what they're dealing with here. So at this point, the latter half of the 1800s, there's a conscious effort to forge a common national identity and mythology. And the Germans would draw from things like the Grimm folk tales, Gothic literature, werewolf traditions. All this stuff got used and wrapped together. The forests were lauded as the home and spiritual center of the German soul, and there was an idealization of nature and what they call natural living. This is called the Volkish movement, and it's a very varied, complex, and in my opinion, a little crazy, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. However, Germans also started identifying themselves by declaring who they weren't, creating groups of people within Germany who were foreign, who were other, not German, and could never be German no matter how hard they tried. People like the Romani, Slavs, the Jews. You know where this is going, and I don't think I have to spell it out further. What was also going on during all of this was a building wave of nationalism and imperialism, a desire for Germany to be and be seen as one of the great powers of Europe, like the United Kingdom or France, or in some ways Russia. So Germany industrializes and starts trying to get overseas colonies, competing with the established powers I just listed. Again, I'm drastically generalizing and there's a lot of oversimplification going on, but this gives you a rough idea. I am going to say though, do not use this video for your history homework, okay? Go read a book. The heavy industrialization, however, does create feelings of alienization and isolation in many Germans, which leads to many of them to long for a more community-oriented and slower time of life. Then World War One happens, and no matter what your feelings on who won and who lost, it's undeniable that World War One was a disaster for the German people. And the Germans start seeing themselves as an oppressed and colonized people, one whose spirit had been sapped of its strength. And many people would call for a German revitalization based on common German blood and soil. Again, you know where this is going. Various occultic and fringe groups would arise declaring that soon a messiah, a heroic figure from myth, would emerge to seize power and lead Germans to salvation and rid and protect them from foreign parasites and their servants. You know where this is going. One of these groups is actually a splinter group of the Theosophy movement, which hopefully you guys remember from last week. If not, please go watch the Mystics of Atlantis video. This splinter movement calls itself Ayranism. I couldn't find a definite pronunciation, and I'm going to be honest, I kind of hold this ideology in contempt, so I didn't put that much effort into it, guys. But the word literally means wisdom concerning the Aryans. And this group was at the forefront of this occultic movement and was able to capture the imagination of many Germans. Now, I'm going to be honest, this group never became like super mainstream, but think of it as like QAnon, and you have an idea of how popular it was. Now, this group embraced a number of ideas. For example, they promoted the idea that Aryans were the people of Atlantis, and they stole Jean Bailly's belief that Hyperborea and Atlantis were one and the same. They also preached a doctrine that would become known as Indo-Aryism, the idea that some of the surviving Aryans of Atlantis had fled into India and Tibet and founded Hinduism and Buddhism to preserve their secret knowledge, basically. The Germans, of course, in this story are the largest and purest group of Aryan survivors left on the planet because, well, they're not going to share the spotlight with anybody. Now, one of the more successful and popular methods this group had of communicating their ideas to the average German was a magazine called Ostaria. The magazine often peddled lurid images of blonde women being menaced by dark ape-like monsters who had to be defeated by strong, courageous men of Aryan blood. It preached the idea of a race war, bluntly, and was not just incredibly anti-Semitic, comparing Jews to vampires, but was also anti-feminist and anti-socialist. Uh, Believing that socialism was a foreign ideology set up to sap the will of the German people. Hitler was known to have been a reader of these magazines, and a lot of the themes and images that the magazine used would show up in his speeches. So Hitler was capitalizing on these popular ideas to pull people in. And the members of this movement recognized this, and many of them would openly call Hitler the awaited German Messiah, and he would play into that in ways in order to get more money and more political support. Now, as far as we can tell, Hitler was not a true believer in a lot of this stuff. I don't think Hitler really bought into the whole Atlantis Hyperborean Aryan myth, but he was willing to use it to achieve power. And that is something to keep in mind. Hitler is willing to use these ideas to achieve power, but there are other people in Nazi society that were true believers. One of the pipelines was a part of the Arisophic movement called the Thule Society. They adopted the name because they believed that Thule was the capital of Atlantis, and Atlantis was the strongest nation in the Hyperborean civilization, which they saw as this grand project that spanned down from the Arctic Circle into Northern Europe and across Asia. Hitler would join these groups and help transform it into a mass movement because the Thule Society was experimenting with blending mass political spectacle with esoteric and occultic beliefs. And the Thule Society ended up providing a lot of early Nazi propagandists and ideas that helped get the Nazis into society. For example, the Nazis of the Thule Society would fund and throw pagan festivals, the two biggest being in 1920 and 1922, with the goal of getting their ideas out into the common German society. And in many ways, the Thule Society became a staging ground and a gateway for early Nazi activists. And again, many of these guys were true believers that believed in this vast prehistoric Aryan civilization centered in the Arctic continent they called Hyperborea, and they preached the idea that Germans had lost the abilities and powers of these prehistoric figures who were stronger and smarter because they arose in an ice age where they had to fight for survival. But these powers could be regained if the Germans were willing to purify themselves and live correctly. You know where this is going. Now, a legitimate question here might be, if these Aryans are so awesome, how did their civilization fall in the first place? Well, that leads us to world ice theory. I've been pretty open so far about my contempt and loathing of these ideologies. It's going to get worse from here, guys, so kind of brace yourselves, but I'm not in the mood to tiptoe. So, world ice theory, just to be blunt about it, it's a religion dressed up as a scientific theory, and that kind of shit needs to stop. And why do I call it a religion? Well, first of all, the creator of it, Hans Herbinger, literally dreamed it up. There's no experimentation, no observation, no math, nothing. Just dreams and mystic revelations. That is not science, that is religion. And to be clear here, I am not hostile to the idea of religion. I am religious. I am a Christian. I believe Jesus died and rose from the dead after 3 days. I believe that a Jewish carpenter from 2,000 years ago is not only not dead, but is God. And I am okay with dying on that hill. You don't have to believe that, but I do. Let's make that clear. And if you want to have world ice as your religion, first of all, why? There's so many better choices, but sure, if that's your thing, you can believe it. I just think you're making a huge mistake, but faith is something that should be left to the individual in my mind. But it's not science, and we shouldn't pretend religion is science. They are two different things. We need to accept that dividing line and just move on with our lives, all of us. And some of you are going to go, hey, Garvin, you're being really rough on this, and you haven't even told us what it is. Fair enough. But just keep in mind, once you know, you can't ever unlearn this. This will always be lodged in your brain. So if you'd rather keep that, part of your brain free for something more important, like who won the third Super Bowl, please skip the next 90 seconds or so for your own safety, starting now. World ice is the idea that out in the solar system there are hidden worlds and moons made entirely of ice. And space is not a void, but a mystical medium also made of ice. So that there are worlds of ice orbiting around a medium of ice. You can't complain to me that this doesn't make sense. I didn't make it up, and I literally warned you to skip. They also preach the idea that the world floods of myth, the ice ages, and other natural disasters were in fact the result of these mystic ice moons slamming into the world and somehow not killing us all. One of these impacts, they said, destroyed the Hyperborean Aryan civilization and drowned Atlantis. Himmler, possibly worried that these people might actually out-crazy him, went one step further and declared that it was obvious that Aryans were descended from genetic material brought to Earth by an earlier ice moon, and disasters wrought from the impacts were also responsible, for the creation of subhuman monsters of myth. Hitler was openly supportive of ice world theory and often overruled German scientists who wanted to get rid of this damn thing. These people were running a country. This dogma was used to help dehumanize the future victims of the Nazis. Germans were good and pure and born of DNA from the stars. Their enemies were subhuman, born of monstrous breedings, and not even really related to real humans like the Germans. It's that kind of language that lets people do terrible things because they can convince themselves that their victims aren't human and in some way deserve it. So the Atlanteans and Hyperboreans and the myths that involved becomes this small but load supporting part of a narrative structure that the Nazis used to prime the German populace to commit some of the worst crimes against humanity on record. I think it's fair to ask why the Germans were so open to this narrative, look, this is insane. We're literally talking about DNA from ice moons leading to superhuman civilizations that are destroyed by more ice moons. Comic books make more sense than this. I say this as someone who loves comic books, but there's some crazy comic books out there. This out-crazies them. It's just, look, you read this stuff, and it's, these people were in charge of a country. And they're not just brutal thugs in designer fashion, but also stark, raving mad lunatics. These people shouldn't have been allowed to run Waffle House. I'm sorry. I needed to get that off my chest. Thank you for your indulgence there. But getting back to my question, why were the average Germans, many of whom didn't buy into this Atlantis stuff or thought this ice moon stuff was a bunch of hooey, still bought into this narrative, still were willing to go along and commit atrocities? Frightening, brutal atrocities that we're closer to 100 years away than we aren't, and these things are still traumatizing. I think part of it ties back to what I said earlier about how Germans felt not just oppressed and colonized, but alienated from their own communities and cut off from their own land. If you remember my earlier video on Hyperborea, Hyperborea in a lot of ways represented not just a place, but a time. A simpler, easier, safer time when humanity and nature are not in conflict, and just getting the basics of life is not a daily struggle, but something that is easy and in some ways even pleasurable. And Atlantis invokes the idea of this grand golden age and learning and power on top of that. One the Germans felt they had stolen from them when they lost World War I. One that Hitler not only told them was stolen from them, but was promising to get back for them from the people he blamed for it. Most of the people he blamed were in fact Germans. The Jews, the communists, the people of Slavic origin, they were German speaking, they were German born, they were loyal to Germany, but that didn't protect them. That did not save them because they were easily available to be scapegoated. This narrative allowed him to cut off those loyal Germans from the rest of Germany, isolate them from the community, and focus the rage and hate that people felt onto them, to give those other Germans, the ones following the Nazis, someone to blame for their troubles. And that's a powerful drug. We all know that. Being able to point at someone and say, you are the reason my life sucks. It is your fault. It's not grand and personal forces. It's not the strange, unknowable machinery of society. It's you, a dude with a face and a name that I can confront. That feels good. That gives you the possibility of closure, catharsis, revenge. You know where this is going. And this is why you should always be careful when someone comes along and tells you that they can help you return to a simpler, better time. And all you have to do to make yourself great again is get rid of the undesirables. We're all bad, twisted things anyways. Like I said in an earlier video, welcome to history. It often rhymes. Once the Nazis took power and were secure in their power, they turned on a lot of these organizations. A lot of this was Hitler wanted to be the only voice for the German people and the only voice to the German people. He was not going to tolerate independent competing prophets on the stage with him. There was only going to be one German prophet, one German Messiah, one Führer, and that was him. That said, a lot of these organizations voluntarily dissolved themselves. They felt their purpose had been achieved. The German Messiah had arrived, and now all there was to do was to support him and do whatever was necessary to make sure that he led the German people to victory. And we all know where that led. The Nazis would end up going from arguably one of the strongest nations in Europe to not even the second most powerful nation in their own capital. And that's where this stuff leads you. I'm not gonna lie, folks, I found the research for this video to be exhausting, but I felt if I was gonna trace the myth of Atlantis, I had to confront the darker, uglier parts as well. Because here's the deal. Myth can be good and ennobling. It can help you understand humanity and yourself, but it can also be used for bad things. It can be used to justify terrible actions, to tell a pretty story to distract you from the ugly reality, and we always have to be aware of that. That doesn't mean we abandon myth, it just means we have to keep our eyes open. That said, I hope this video was informative or at least gave you some food for thought. If so, please leave a like, a comment, or even subscribe. This helps me in my own battle against, as I like to call it, the Dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. We also have a Patreon that you can join where you can vote on upcoming topics, hopefully lighter topics for the rest of the year. And you also get access to patron-only material. At this point, the Cole video should be up for my patrons. There's also my many feelings on the Republic available in the Patreon. Speaking of Patreons, let me give a shout out to my biggest supporter, Big Steve. I hope this video didn't depress you too much, man. We're going to see some more, if not uplifting, at least less exhausting and lighter fare next week. We're going to be taking a look at different fiction in the mid-20th century, works of Mr. Clarke, Howard, Burroughs. We're just going to do a single video on that. Then we're going to talk about the professor himself, J.R.R. Tolkien, and look at New Memoria, the ancient civilization that would lead to Aragorn. And we're also going to look at Aquaman, and we're going to talk about Namor a little bit. And of course, Disney's Atlantis is coming. I know some of you are looking forward to that. If there's some other Atlantis fiction or some other work you feel that needs a video, please leave a comment. Again, like and subscribe. That really helps out. But until next week, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and as always, keep reading.